Okay, it is now 3 minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining today in today's live training, Fuzzy Matching. For those of you who were joining a little earlier, I'm sorry for any hiccups you might have had with the link that brought you into this session. But I think we are all settled now. So let's just settle in and learn a little bit about fuzzy matching. First things first, before we go any further, I just want to let you know that the session will run about 45 minutes to an hour. And anytime there's questions along the way, I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Everyone is muted by default, so if you do want to ask those questions, I recommend that you go into the Q&A panel. Now, I always do note to our attendees that there is a difference between the chat and Q&A panel. My preferred method for mediating the discussions here is through the Q&A because I can track what I've answered and what I haven't along the way. So it just makes it a little bit easier for me to make sure that everybody's questions are getting addressed. Also, this session is being recorded, so if you do have any questions along the way that you think you just want to loop back to at a later time, what we'll try to do is post this up so this is available to you. Now, I also, there's going to be a point in the session where it's going to go from really slow to really fast, right? So if there's any point where you feel like you're just hanging on and might not be following 100% and you just need some time to have a video to scrub through, we will have that available back at the original post. In addition to that, I will make note that that original post here, as of a few minutes ago, it does have an attached workflow as well, this fm.yxzp. So you can go ahead and download that, and you'll see an exact view of what I'm going to be building out today. So it's going to be pretty simple and straightforward, but if you do want something to follow along with, you could use that or just kind of a takeaway asset from that from today's training. So without further ado, let's just jump into a few things. First, we're going to discuss some upcoming trainings, workflow background, actually build that workflow that I shared with you, and then cover off on some support items at the end. Just as a note, if you haven't visited any other place of community besides the live training area or the academy in general, we highly recommend that you do, especially in the context of this fuzzy matching training, because there are a lot of questions out there and a lot of problems addressed with our community. In fact, as I was going through and preparing for the session today, I did see that there was someone who had a question about fuzzy matching, and they were working through that problem right then and there. So there is a wealth of resources out there. Also, check out our knowledge base article on that fuzzy match tool, which might help you along the way. Beyond that, if you have any, if you just want to read blog posts or have ideas about the product, or you just want to check out some weekly challenges, go ahead and check those out. I think I might be standing up a weekly challenge in the near future around fuzzy matching tool because we haven't done much of it today. So get some opportunity for people to try it out a little bit more. So let's jump into fuzzy matching and kind of the use case of why fuzzy matching exists. And I imagine for many people who are here on the call today have already arrived on the conclusion that they need fuzzy matching. But if you're here just for the sake of knowledge and for the sake of knowing what it is and if it's the right fit for you, by all means, this might be helpful for you. So our issue is that our data set represents a manual entry system, kind of the bane of all data analysts' existence, right? Anything that's a manual entered system is subject to failure. So the way someone might type in my name, Joseph, for example, might be very different from how the next person does or the next person does. And in fact, as a fun side note, I went 3 years with a driver's license with a misspelled name of my own. So they might even fuzzy match my own driver's license for that matter. So it is not uncommon for these manual entry systems to fail as you start bringing on people with different backgrounds, different understandings. You know, if I grew up in a family that spelled Joseph in a way that wasn't common, then I might think that's the common way for everybody, right? Maybe a Joseph, right? It might be the way some people spell it, where I technically spell mine Joseph. So there's a lot of different ways that people work with it, but typically you see this fuzzy matching really come into play around names or people entering names into systems. In addition, it'll be a guide once you get into that fuzzy match tool, but you see people have difficulties with matching addresses because you could have 123 ABC way, and somebody else might add a unit number, or it might be on line 2, right? So there's a lot of different things or scenarios that can come out where your data set doesn't mesh together from a manual entry system. So our goal is to use the fuzzy match tool to identify records that are duplicated. So how do we circumnavigate kind of the differences when things aren't one-to-one? So here it's kind of a similar workflow, but not quite the one-for-one of what we're going to build today. But you'll notice that there's a certain pattern, and this is one of the things I want you to walk away with today, is this idea of a pattern of what goes into a fuzzy matching process, right? Because many times in Alteryx, especially from a training perspective, when we talk about something, we talk about the tool, right? Here's the training on fuzzy match. Well, when we talk about fuzzy match, realistically, you have to train a set of 5 tools that should happen again and again and again. So what we hope to impart on you today, and what is exactly there in that download that I provided, is some sort of template that you might be able to work off of to make sure that your data is flowing through the fuzzy match tool in the best way possible. So beyond that fuzzy match tool, we'll see a lot of uniques, joins, unions, and some record IDs along the way. So what is fuzzy matching, right? It's a process that enables the identification of duplicates or matches that aren't exactly the same, right? In the fuzzy match tool, users have the ability to set thresholds for acceptable levels of difference between records. So this is to say, right, whenever we do a join, for example, between two data sets, we guarantee to the character, to the dot, that things are 100% matching, not a single difference, right? But what if you wanted to match on something that's 98% likely to match, or 90% similarity, right? Or 97 or 80%. That's what the fuzzy match is about. And what I'd like to say is, if there was a few points that people could walk away from the session, this would be the first. The first is the emphasis on the word fuzzy. Fuzzy being that it is not an exact science. And I know that can be difficult for people to work with, right? That they want some sort of silver bullet that'll say, I will take everything that doesn't match and make it work. But the reality is there is no silver bullet, right? This will get you closer to that, but there's going to be a lot of work on your behalf to make this happen, right? And I think for a lot of this, it's a lot of data discovery, right? And I think this fits into a class of tools that are unlike any other. So I think when I think of this class of tools, I think of fuzzy matching, I think of predictive, I think of optimization. I think of all these tools in the same class, in the sense that you don't just build them once and move past them, right? Usually you spend most of your workflow working within that tool, refining, updating. What do you see on the output? Is it what you'd expect? Is it what you'd want, right? This tool is a pretty iterative process. It's not as simple as dropping on the canvas and moving on. So I really want to emphasize, if you were to walk away with anything today, is there is no right or wrong answer to fuzzy matching. In fact, at its very base, fuzzy matching is very easy. What's very difficult is accommodating that fuzzy matching to your business logic or your business rules or how your system has been populated. So don't just take my word for it, right? Here's some quotes that we pulled right off the community. This stuff is not an exact science. You have to generate a model based on your data and use that one that gives the most confidence, right? And another one says fuzzy matching is an art. And in fact, when we run these sessions at Inspire, we only label it as an art, because what we are using is computer science, but at the end of the day, we cannot accommodate for 100% of scenarios. So we want to make sure that we impart that on people, that the process they are doing, you'll have to intervene in, right? You'll have to work with along the way to make sure that it's producing the results you expected, and you can walk away with kind of a winning combination. So what I'm showing here on this next view is the actual fuzzy match tool itself. So there are really 2 different modes that you can do within the fuzzy matching tool. The first one is purge, and the second one is merge. Okay, a nice a nice rhyming scheme there. But really, what purge says is looks through the data set and says, I'm going to remove duplicates or dedupe my data set. So if I have 2 records that are 98% alike, maybe I want to purge one of those out to make sure that I have no duplicates in my data set. You could be doing it for the sake of deduping your data set, but also what we see frequently is people like to purge their data before they merge their data, right? So that is to say, fuzzy matching can be a very expensive process. It can be very time consuming, especially at volume. So to save on time, what many people do is first run through their data set and make sure they remove any duplication along the way to make sure that they're not fuzzy matching on something that's previously been fuzzy matched somewhere else in their data set. Merge mode is what most people think of when they come to fuzzy matching, right? Are A and B similar, right? And how similar are they? It's basically your join, right, that you might be working with that isn't an exact match. So that is your first step in the fuzzy match tool, is to decide whether you're going to merge or purge. Today, we're going to run on the assumption that my data set has already been purged, because the merge is actually a little bit of a more difficult configuration. So if you know how to merge, it's easy to know how to purge along the way. So the one thing that I will call out, though, that is different is even though we say that merge is a join, it only has one input. Okay, so what typically you see when people run a merge is they have to union the two data sets that they would normally join together into one data set and run them across. Now, how does the fuzzy match tool know what is data set 1 and data set 2? Well, you'll see as a part of our process, we basically have to create a field that is a flag for which one is the correct source. So here's where we have the source field that says, hey, I'm data set 1 or data set 2. Make sure I'm not matching data set 1 on data set 1 or data set 2 on data set 2, right? I only want data set 1 to be fuzzy matched against data set 2. Also, beyond that is we need a record ID field, and this is really important. So let's say my name is Joe Miller, and in another data set I have Joseph Miller, right? When we fuzzy match across something, the fuzzy match tool, and this is really important, only outputs the record ID, okay? It doesn't output the actual names, Joe or Joseph. It'll say, hey, Joseph Miller in this data set, which is record ID 10, was kind of close to Joe Miller in this other data set that was record 500, right? And it will just show me on the output that 10 is within 80% of 500. So it's really important that you have the correct record IDs to set up, and you'll see after we do this fuzzy match, if you're anything like me, you'd like to do a visual check on how these record IDs are. So I'll basically join these my names back together into the field after this fuzzy match to actually see what it's comparing to and what record is really being represented there. And then down here, what we have is kind of a match threshold, which we're actually going to talk a little bit more about, and a series of match fields, right? So what am I fuzzy matching on? In this case, there's a address, zip code, last name, and there's some advanced options. But I'm actually going to toggle back and forth between some screens here because this actually opens up a huge discussion on how records get processed in order for fuzzy matching to work. So what is the process? I go back and forth on training this process, right? Because sometimes there's kind of an ignorance is bliss. You know, what you get is what you get. But when it comes down to it, and actually this was pertinent to the issue that I saw earlier this morning on community, sometimes it's good to know the whole process to understand where it's going wrong or where it's going right. Okay, so let's go ahead and describe the process. Now, I've very intentionally displayed this as kind of an upside down pyramid because you can think of this whole process as kind of a continual filter, right? You must pass step 1 to get to step 2. You must pass step 2 to get to step 3, so on and so forth. So really, at the end, what you have down here is going to have your output fuzzy matched results. But for your data to get all the way to the bottom, it's got to pass all of these tests. And so that's why it's important for troubleshooting, because at any point in time, your data set can fail, right, these tests. So it's important to know where they're going. So the first of which is key generation. Okay, so you can think of this as kind of pre-vetting for a fuzzy match. So I like to say that it's, well, let me start this way. I've mentioned before that fuzzy matching is a really expensive process, and net, the less we can fuzzy match, the better my workflow is going to be because it's about speed and efficiency, right? So what these keys do is it's basically going to be a generation that's going to be essentially abbreviation or shorthand of what your values are within that field. So if my name is Joseph, right, it might abbreviate it down to a key of JSF, right? Something that's really sounds like Joseph but without all the strings. and see if that matches anywhere else to another key within another data set, right? So it generates all these keys, and I'm actually going to show you those, so it'll actually make a little bit more sense though. But it's going to generate keys for each of the records and each of the fields. And then what it's going to do, it's going to match up to find where all keys match, right? So let's say, for example, I had that example of Joseph, and Joseph spelled two different ways. Let me pop open a notepad just so I can be a little bit more visual about this. Joseph and Joseph, right? And we want to see if this is the same person inside of our system. When we go into key generation, and I actually am not a computer scientist in this, so I actually might not be generating this correctly, but what it's likely to do is generate a key that looks something like this, right? Hey, I see this looks like JSF, and the way it's kind of delineated this, and there's a whole key generation methodology of how I want to generate these keys, but this case could be a metaphone, right? Based on how this word sounds, right? So when I say Joseph, right, even though there's a PH, it sounds more like an S, right? Whereas this one, even Joseph this way, right, will have a similar key. So this was my key generation step. Now I have to see if these two records are alike, which they are, so it'll go on and do a fuzzy matching process on them, right? But it's important to know this is not fuzzy matching at this point, this key generation. It's just seeing if the data is a good candidate for fuzzy matching before it actually gets there, right? So I've generated all the keys and they do match. Remember, remember that it's for all of my fields, right? So if I had my first name like Joseph, my last name Miller, I had my address, my zip code, my state, right? What it's going to do is it's going to generate a key for each field within that row. And what it's going to do for each of those fields, it's going to concatenate those keys into one long string, right, for that record. And it's going to match that record against all other records to make sure that all keys match. And that's when it's a really good candidate. So you're not actually fuzzy matching on one field, you're fuzzy matching on the combination of fields and saying how likely are these two records identical, right, or close to the same. So beyond that, once the keys do match, right, then we actually have to go into the fuzzy matching where we actually say how they pass field thresholds, okay? So if I were to go back to this other slide here really quick, I have this match field scenario, right? So here's that the fields that I've chosen to generate keys on, primary address, zip code, and last name. And within each of these, if I were to click a button, I would have to say what the threshold of fuzzy matching would be in order for them to quote unquote pass, right? So in this case, what if I said 90% primary address, 85% match to zip code, 90% match to last name? In order for anything to match or come into through my filter, is it's got to pass each of those thresholds for each field, right? So for those three fields that I just showed, each of them have to be higher than 95%, 85%, and 90% respectively. Now those are totally toggleable. You can change those. You can change how that logic is generated. But do note that that will prevent your data from yet again passing any further. Next up is an overall threshold, right? So I've generated kind of a score for every single field within my row, for example. But I don't guarantee that all of these rows kind of combine to an overall score that I want for that record. And you can see that was actually denoted right above those fields within the fuzzy match tool. So I must denote an overall match threshold. And then finally, once it passes all of those tests, it outputs the matched pairs, okay? Now there is an option in this fuzzy match tool. By default, it will only show you matched pairs, but you can also output unmatched pairs just to view what happened along the way. And that's really great for troubleshooting as you use this as a reference guide, because you can see, oh, you know, if it generated keys, did the keys not match the way I expected? Why didn't they match? Do I need to change how the keys are generated? And if so, you know, if they passed and they did match, why didn't they match at this level? Was it the type of fuzzy matching methodology that I chose, or the threshold that I put on it? Was it just too stringent or too lax, right? So that's something that you will have along the way. And I will say, right, that especially as you're building these processes for the first time and really defining your business systems, that's going to have to use your eyes, right? You're going to have to really investigate your data and understand where it matches and where it doesn't, and what you're really comfortable with along the way, right? Um, and I know that can sometimes seem uninviting, but it's the reality of working with the data, right? There's not going to be a silver bullet that's going to say, hey, John Smith is going to be the same person as Joseph Miller, if you went into witness protection program. We just don't have that logic built in, right? It's kind of beyond the bounds of our computer science today. So when working with each of the fields, you can see if I hit the edit button from a few slides back over here. Let me go back over here. I have my field names and I have a match style, and I can really tweak that match style. This is the way I like. Always and forever start with a pre-configured match style, and I cannot kind of reinforce this enough for our users. If you go from scratch, you will probably be less successful and less quick about getting to your solution. Even if there's something that isn't related to any of these pre-configured match styles, it's still good to choose something that you think might be the closest. So if I were doing, toys, for example, I might just be like, oh, company name is my best bet, right, for that, and try to leverage some of those matching styles off of that. It's always good to start with this as a good baseline and kind of refine from there, right? So usually when I'm working with the fuzzy match tool for each field, I'll actually just run them in a pre-configured match style and investigate my data. Do I like it? Do I not? What do I want to tweak? Go back, update, and then once I update it, you'll see it kind of inherits a custom style, which we'll talk about once we start building our workflow. But by default, right, here are some of the ones that we work with. It's just there's three different types of addressed pre-configured match styles. There's company names, there's exact matching, right? Names with nicknames, phone, and zip. Names with nicknames is a really interesting one in this case because let's say we are working with Joe and Joseph, right? Looking at the strings themselves, they are quite different, right? One has 3 words, one has many more words. One actually has a PH, the other one does not. So they actually, on a character-by-character basis, they seem very distant and are likely not to match to each other. However, the reality is that something like that should have a really close relationship because it's just 2 different ways of writing the same thing. So some of these fuzzy matching styles, like name with nicknames, actually has, for lack of a better word, a lookup table in the background. So anytime you see a Dave and you're trying to fuzzy match to a David or Rick to Richard, for example, something that might seem distant, we actually have a lookup table that can say, hey, those are actually closer than you think, but you can actually set what type of penalty, if any, right? Do you want to say there's no penalty, they are 100% match, or just kind of downgrade them, give them a 5% difference in their matching levels just because it is a little different than we expect. You can actually assign that along the way. So names with nicknames is an interesting one, and you can actually, with a lot of the fuzzy matching stuff, you can dictate some of those background lookup tables to make sure that things aren't being penalized where they need not be penalized. So the art of fuzzy matching, right, I've already hammered home that it's not just one visit to the fuzzy matching tool. It's revisiting the same fuzzy match tool again and again. Now I'm going to actually go a little bit higher and say that it might not take one fuzzy match tool. It might take many fuzzy match tools. Okay, so what we typically see, right, is people join 2 data sets together and say, here's our 100% one-for-one matches, not a problem. Then they'll go in and build a fuzzy matching tool and say, I want all of these rules, and I want them to have a 95% likelihood, right? And then bucket them into my join. And then I'll go back and do another tier beyond that after those pass, saying, okay, anything above 90, anything above 85, 80. And people will essentially create these tiers of levels of logic, of matching to make sure that they match to a certain level. And we call this the waterfall process, right? Making sure that you can create these tiers of what matches when, right? Or if there just needs to be a different type of fuzzy matching use case per grouping of data in your data set, right? So it is important to know for any of those pre-configured matching styles, and I kind of hinted at this, right? You can change how these keys are generated. So if you're not happy with the output of the keys, you can change it. You can choose the different matching functions. You can edit those thresholds. You can even choose to not generate the keys, which would actually push all of your field values to be fuzzy matched. But I would be careful, right? Because the first thing is that you're kind of circumnavigating the reason why it's there. And the reason would be is to kind of thin out your data before it gets to the fuzzy matching and kind of make sure that it's a fast process. The second of which is just making sure it's a high fidelity experience, right? Making sure that everything that is there is meant to be there. Now, in some cases, you might not want to generate keys. In fact, some of our experts will say they recommend never generating keys for first names, right? First names are just a really big wild card. Never generate keys there. But you will need to make sure that somewhere in your data set, when you saw that I had 3 fields selected for fuzzy matching in the last one, something will need to have a key, right? So if you were only fuzzy matching one field and that one field was only first names and you chose not to generate a key, it will not work. Somewhere in there, one of those fields have to be generating a key. Okay, so how do I generate keys? All right, if you wanted to jump into this, I could sit here and read this off to you, but I don't think it would be very helpful. I will say that none was something we just visited, so you can kind of circumnavigate that filter and just move on to the fuzzy matching process. But again, that's something we only recommend for first names and nothing else. Let's say you had, street values or unit values, right? You could actually kind of just generate keys for only the digits within that particular string. Double metaphone, so this is actually doesn't look at the literal characters, but rather at the sounds, right? So when I visited Joseph and Joseph, one with an F and one with a PH, those both kind of have that F sound at the end. What that will do is generate a key to reflect kind of the pronunciation of that. And SoundX is kind of a similar idea, but it is not as suitable for non-European names. Typically, I see double metaphone used a little bit more, but it's something you might just want to play around with and see as a whole. And then the final options that we have is kind of the whole field, right? This one's going to be a very strict setting, and I don't see this one very much, but the entire value must match to each other. So the field is the key. And then second, alphanumeric, so it's just going to strip out any special characters along the way. Now, some of that can be circumnavigated, and we'll talk about that in a second. So key generation. This is the first step that we talked about in our fuzzy matching process, and a kind of a quick picture of what's happening here. So we talked about all of those methodologies. We have one of our fuzzy matching experts here at Alteryx. Her name is Kaylin Swingle. She actually showed an example of her name written in many different ways, right? So for a name like Kaylin, and this is the actual way you might spell her name, a lot of people over the phone might hear her say Caitlin and enter that into their system. And you can see from how the key is being generated, right, that it's generating a key for the first name, KTLN, whereas Kaylin would just be a KLN, right? So these two fields would not match to each other just simply because the keys don't match to each other. Now, if I were to go through and say, hey, which keys match, I can see David Swingle and David Jr. Swingle would actually match together, so that would enter into a fuzzy matching process. And I think that's about it, right? So making sure that your match keys look similar or you're changing how that key generation works is going to be important to you to making sure that the right values pass into the fuzzy matching process. Now, into the match functions, you could probably spend a week-long course really just talking about how computer science measures similarity between words. But as a whole, the two big ones are Levenstein and Jaro. And a lot of people toggle between the two based on what they work from their background. But Levenstein, basically, at a very high level, will just accept very slight differences in characters, where Jaro is typically just a more lenient matching function. So keep those two in mind. If you find that Levenstein is a little too strict, flip over to Jaro and go there. But if you want to learn more, certainly hit the Alteryx help for more detailed definitions, and even beyond that. There's a lot of good articles out there, but it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole because this goes down to almost the binary level at a computer, right? So you could go down this so far, you're working on a silicon chip. So there's a lot that goes into these, but these are not Alteryx methodologies. These are just computer science concepts that are being used through the fuzzy matching tool. So that's really it for the matching functions that we're going to talk about. I think what's going to be really important is just getting into this and looking through a fuzzy match tool, and more importantly, talking about some of the process and some of the patterns that you should look up, right? Before you go, some tips and tricks. The first of which is data cleansing and data preparation. Um, Set yourself up for success, right? If you have uppercase letters and lowercase letters, it's always good to make sure that everything is on the same page in terms of case sensitivity. Make sure that if you don't want punctuation to be a part of the fuzzy matching process, that you strip that out. Make sure there's no white space, right? The cleaner that you can make your incoming data, the more important it's going to be. And in fact, there probably should be a course about data preparation for fuzzy matching, just as we do for predictive analytics. But make sure that you pre-process your data, right? In addition to that, right, find and replace all known equivalents, right? So if you have kind of a lookup table of something like Kleenex and tissue, Jello and gelatin, or things that kind of are replaceable, make sure that everything is kind of on the same page. And then beyond that, you can improve what's happening by using provided lookup tables. So for example, if I had the nicknames lookup table for my fuzzy matching tool, maybe I have an organization, or I have my own organization that I'm an HR analyst for. Maybe I'll actually put in some of the names and nicknames for my organization to make sure that our fuzzy match is more successful. And of course, just being on the community and discovering more. And finally, this is one of those things that this is a jumping off platform from this training. Certainly something that you can start today and actually develop a workflow with, but really where you're going to become more of an expert is just being really iterative on it, practicing, testing what works, what doesn't. In fact, one of the things that I always recommend to people is just pull in the text tool, right? See what happens, what doesn't when I bring two particular words together. So let's jump into the designer and start building out a workflow. And I'm actually going to follow my exact advice, right? So one of the things that I like to do right off the bat is I'm just going to do something called first name, right? I'm going to put in those two letters, Joseph, right? And you'll see that there's a few things needed in order for my fuzzy matching to work. I want to make sure that I have an ID number, so I'm going to add an ID of 1 and 2. I'll add a source saying new field, or this is a new value I just got in from one system, and this is my old. And let's just see how that fuzzy matches together, right, and really inspect it. So I'm going to drag a fuzzy match tool in here, jump into merge, and I'm just going to build this really quick. I'll probably spend more time on it later. But I'll say my source field is source, my record ID is ID, and the field that I want to work with is first name. And I'm going to choose a match style of name with nicknames. Let's just add a browse tool and see what happens. Okay, so I have my two records going in, and you'll see on my output is 0 coming out. So one of the things that you're most likely to see on the community is something saying, hey, I'm not even seeing my data coming out. What I'd recommend is for people to go ahead and crack this open and click this output on matched records here. And I also like to output match score generated keys. Generated keys is going to be a really big one because you can see what it actually used for that logic to kind of build those keys. So here you can have two different scenarios, right? And based on this particular logic that I built in here, I'm going to toggle back here, first name, name with nicknames. It's actually a double metaphone, which is essentially kind of generating a key based on how it sounds. The important thing to know is that it actually can generate multiple match keys, right? So I can say, oh, Joseph, it could be a key that looks like this, it could be a key that looks like that, but not really the same to each other, right? That's something that we got to look for. So it looks like two different versions generated to each other. But it looks like somewhere along the way our match keys didn't match to each other, or they didn't have a specific threshold that passed, right? So there are a lot of different things that we can do to reduce that, but I'm going to do that within a workflow to show how we can be more successful. So let me bring two data sets onto my canvas, and we'll go ahead and get started. Sorry for any computers just lagging a little bit here. So let's bring in data set 1. Please be patient as I navigate to this. believe I grabbed the wrong one here. Okay. Here we go. I'm just going to copy this and bring in my other data set here. Could be my new data. Okay. So what I have here is two different data sources, right? One of which represents kind of my main database, and then every week I get a new extract of data, right? So here's my new data, here's my main data, and you might have different rules around how you want to bring data together, right? For us, it might be, hey, we don't want to bring in new data in here that might already exist there. So we might want to run a whole fuzzy matching process. So the first thing that I might do, right, is, and I'm going to circumnavigate a whole process that we talked about that is so entirely important, is making sure that these are prepped in a way that will be successful in a fuzzy match tool. But in this case, I know my data sets are pretty well matched. And I'd neglected to say, in addition to that, that this data does represent address information, zip code, first name, and last name, right? So let's go ahead and just find what is shared between these two data sets. What is identical, right? So I'm going to bring in a join tool. And this is probably the experience of why most of us are here today, is after building this particular part of our workflow. What's my first name, last name, zip code, and address. And I'm going to go ahead and add a browse tool, this workflow here, and run it. And you'll see, even as I have these high-level numbers, of 1,000 records here and 938 here, only 5, a mere 5 joined between those data sets. And that's a lot to kind of arouse suspicion, right? I feel like we're better than that. I feel like we have more matches. So we need to kind of get into it and find fuzzy matching, see if they can solve some of our problems, right? So let's go ahead. I'm going to go through a process of kind of joining iteratively this new data back to this main data to see what levels of similarity we have, right? So what I like to do, especially if I start tiering these out and saying that I want to do kind of a waterfall process, this is kind of my first step. This is my 100% match scenario. 100% of these records match to each other, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of deselect this right side, aka anything from the new side, just to say that, hey, we're just going to keep these the same. These records don't exist. I don't need them, or they're redundant with what I have there. So I'll just leave those out, and I'm just kind of using this as a placeholder to kind of use to compile into a final data set later on. So these are my 100% match across all of those fields. Now I have to figure out how to fuzzy match across all of them. So there's going to be a couple steps that I'm going to do. So I'm just going to drag on a fuzzy match tool and show you why this doesn't work right out the gate, right? Essentially, I want to fuzzy match these two data sources, anything from main data and new data together that didn't join, into this tool. But you'll see that it only requires one input, or only allows one input. So I need to essentially create a data set that is one compiled list of both left and right, and then submit it into my fuzzy match tool. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. So the first thing of which that I need to make sure to do is I told you that the outcome of this fuzzy match tool is it will never, ever, ever give you the actual address value, the actual first name value, the last name value, or the zip code. It will only give you the ID of the record, right? So we need to give each of these records an ID. So I'm going to create a record ID for kind of the main data and also one for the new data. It'll copy here. There we go. Now the important thing to know is you want to make sure that there's no overlap in record values. You want to make sure that they are distinct between the two data sets. So it's fine to start with one, and I'm looking at this data set and saying, well, it's only going to run to 1,092 for unique values. So I'll just say for the second one, a safe starting value will be 2,000, right? So when I union these together, everything should have a different record ID. And that'll be nice, and you can actually see that as an outcome of our fuzzy matching tool. So everything's been given record IDs, but the last thing that I need to do is actually say when I'm joining these together which data set these come from, right? So I don't want to Cartesian these across each other. I want to make sure that I'm only comparing data set 1 against data set 2. So what I typically do is just bring in a formula tool here. I'm just going to delete that connection. And I'm going to select the column or add a column, and I'm just going to call it source. And I'll call this my main data set. I'm also going to copy this same formula down into the parallel stream below and say this is my new data set. Okay, so now my data is all queued up. I'm ready to bring it into the fuzzy matching tool. So what I'm going to do is bring them into one data set via the union. Okay. So before I configure anything on that fuzzy matching tool, I'm just going to show you what this data set looks like, just so we're all on the same page. Okay, so you can see that they're all union together, all 2020 records, old and new. You can see the sources, main and new, are together. You can see I have different record IDs, right? They're all kind of brought in together, and they live coherently within one data set. Now, what this fuzzy match tool will do is use this source value to say, hey, what's data set 1 and data set 2? So let's go ahead and start with kind of a bare bones fuzzy match production, okay? And I'm just going to Control-Shift-B on this to make sure that I get a browse tool after. And I'm going to say I'm merging. I want to join them together. And my source ID field is going to be that source saying whether it's main or new. Additionally, I need to choose what my record ID field is. And then I need to choose what I want to fuzzy match on. So if I want to do everything that I did within this join tool, it's going to be first name, last name, zip code, and address. Okay? And based on what I've said, right, I always recommend that you start with these pre-configured match styles. So I'm going to say first name should kind of use the match style name with nicknames. Last names, I'm going to choose names. Zip code, we actually have a zip code field, and address. And I can go ahead and run this workflow as it is right now. What it's going to do is it's actually building that filter process and outputting the results. So here's my output. Here's things that fuzzy match together. So that you can actually see why it was so important for me to add that record ID is because it's saying record 810 fuzzy matched with record 2687. Okay. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably like, well, what was the first name for record ID 810 and the first name for record 2687? Do they look somewhat alike, right? And there is a whole process around that. But before we even get there, I also want to add a little bit more context of, how much did they match, right? So I'm going to come back to this fuzzy matching tool. And there's actually a few more selections down here. Output match score and output generated keys, okay? I'm going to go ahead and run that workflow again, and you'll actually see a couple things, right? You'll actually see the keys that were generated for this particular data set here. And then you'll see a score, right? What was the score for the first name? What was the score for the last name? What was the score for the address? What was the overall score, right? So here I could probably dig through this data set and maybe find something low scoring. I see some 95s in there. I can actually go ahead and say what the overall score is, right? Maybe I just want this to be a really high fidelity fuzzy matching process and say only things with a score of 98 should come out of this tool. And if I were to run that workflow again, you'll actually see that the output number is even smaller than before. Okay? So now we're off and running fuzzy matching, and note that we are only outputting things that have matched. Now, if you're in a place where you want to inspect things that haven't matched, I would recommend selecting this output unmatched records. That's going to be really key if you're trying to inspect and troubleshoot things within your data set. In this case, let's just say that I'm really happy with it. I'm going to back this off 90%. I'm going to leave it there. Okay. However, what I am not happy with is maybe how I'm matching on nicknames or how I'm matching on last name. Let's start with something a little easier. Let's start with zip code. I'm going to click on this edit button, and I'm going to get exactly how that particular fuzzy match process happens just for the field of zip code. Okay, so you can see I have this match style up here. That's exactly what I've selected. So it's zip code. Next up, we have this pre-process, right? And this is basically something that happens before your keys are generated within the fuzzy match tool, right? So if you didn't do your data cleansing upstream, this is actually kind of like a last resort. Strip the punctuation out before I do the key generation, or remove salutations and of the kind of dead words along the way. Just kind of grooming that particular value within the zip code to make sure that it is a high fidelity value that we're using for that zip code key generation. Okay, for the most part, a lot of that doesn't really require punctuation or pre-processing unless it's really bad. So if you do need to do that, do need it here, but this is why it's kind of set to this as default, right? Now, the next thing is generate keys, right? How do you want to generate a key? Well, for a zip code, we'd expect that zip codes are, especially for US, right? They're really a digit-only experience. So if someone had typed in a letter, we want to make sure that isn't represented in the key, right? So it's only going to look at the digits only and generate a key for that. So you can kind of see this actually works top to down in the same way that we showed that filter. Let's generate the keys, right? Do we want to generate them for each word? So if I had a full name, I might want to generate a key for the full name by generating a key for each word, or it just might generate a key for the whole field as a default. Here you can set a key length, okay? So zip codes, right, we'd expect to be a length of 5. So this one is actually kind of more of like a literal key match only value. There's really not a lot of fuzzy matching going on here. But it's saying, like, what's the 5 here? Does it match to the 5 there? Now, the less I actually scale back that key length, so if I said the key length was 1 for first name, it's going to choose literally one value out of that word to represent that word. So in one sense, it becomes very lax because anything with that strong J in it is going to probably have J as the key, right? And so Joe and Jamal might match together where they might not be. So the more you increase this length, the more articulate it's going to be around how that key should look, and also be a little bit more stringent. But if you really want more things to pass through that key matching process to get to the match function, then you want to scale that back a little bit, okay? So in this case, there's really no match function, just saying, hey, we strip the keys down to the 5 digits only, make sure the keys match, done and done, right? Easy peasy. And it's going to be 100% match on zip code, so we don't have to edit the match threshold. But let's ramp that up to the next level, right? Let's actually see how addresses are working. So you can see in this one, it's stripping any punctuation. So if you have drive with a period, for example, and one without, that won't make a difference. We'll actually strip that punctuation out. And then we're going to go with double metaphone with digits, right? So it's going to generate a key based on, if it's a word, how it sounds, right? Not how it's spelled, but how it sounds. And then also if there's any digits as a part of that, including that as part of the key. And then in this case, they said make sure the key length is around 8, and they're doing a match function on words and digits, right? This one was grayed out in the last view because we only chose this key match only at the top. But in this case, you can see there's a whole slew of selections if you want to kind of fuzzy match on a character by character basis or on a word by word basis. This one, since we're working with addresses, kind of matches on words and digits using Jaro distance. And again, if you want to learn more about Jaro distance, there's a lot of that in the help menu along the way. So we also do frequency statistics along the way. So let's say I worked for an educational system, right? And the words like, even I might just be running out all of these schools, or trying to fuzzy match on all of these schools within my county, for example. They might have the word school or academy or institution, or a lot of these kind of suffixes that we don't really care about, right? They shouldn't be as important as they should in terms of matching. What I do care about is that the John F. Kennedy Academy matches to the John F. Kennedy School over here, right? And they shouldn't be penalized so much on how frequently some of those words show up based on my data sets, right? So here you can actually choose some of the data sets that you have, and you can actually create some of these frequency statistics yourself. In this case, it's kind of the US addresses one. Like, so don't penalize me as much for some particular words if they don't match, right? And then down here we have a match threshold. So right now I've set it that I want, in order for them to pass to the next level of filter, any addresses 85% should be kind of included. So you'll see when I look at this output data set that no match score for address should be lower than 85%, right? And if it does pass this, then it will go on to the match score to make sure that it is above 97 as it includes first name and last name. So there's a lot going on there within that fuzzy match tool, but I'm actually going to show you kind of how to visualize it all together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this here very quickly and just essentially and very quickly join together my data set. So I'm going to bring in a join tool, drop it in here, bring in the source data. And so you saw we just had the record IDs, so I'm essentially just populating it with the attributes that belong to those record IDs. So record ID belongs to record ID. And then on the other side of this join, I'm going to bring the data back from my other data set, new. I'm going to populate the information from that half of the record. So I'm going to say record 2 is equal to record ID. Okay. Now the final thing that I like to do is I kind of like to line things up side by side. So what I'm going to do is highlight address, zip code, first name, and last name. I'm going to put these right next to each other. I went up one too high. And then what I might do is just actually drag that match score along with them just so I can see that after. Drop that down one. And this is a really great way of inspecting and spot checking. Because like I said, if you just kind of accept it the way it's given to you, it might not accommodate for some use cases that you want. So here you go. This is my output data set. So I can see from data set 1, this is my main values, zip code, address, first name, last name from the source main. And here's those values from new. So 46 Lockwood Drive looks nice, 87103, 87103. You'll see that Alex and Alex match nicely, but it looks like the last name, Arellano, looks like it's a little different from how it's spelled over here, right? It's Arellano, or it's Areilano over here. But it scored a 97% similarity across the whole record, so we kept it along the way. The one thing I actually neglected, I'm going to make sure that I do this right now, and this is critical, is do you remember back at the beginning how I said that for one particular record, it can generate multiple keys on a double metaphone? So what I said was, for address, just because it could be pronounced a few different ways, it's going to pronounce a few different results. So really there is actually some duplication. The same key for the same record might show up multiple times. So what I like to do is run just a quick dedupe on record ID in 1 and 2. As long as they've matched 95% somewhere, I don't care which way they were pronounced. I just care that they're matched together at a 95% level. I'm just going to unique that to make sure that kind of reduces my level. And it does greatly, right? Look, I've gone from 989 down to 653. So this is a little bit more of a high fidelity. So you can actually look through and inspect how nicely or not nicely those go together. And then I loop back and continually kind of tweak this and inspect the results. Okay. Now, I only have 4 minutes left, so I can't build out much more of this process. But what I will show you here, and what you do have downloaded, is what we basically built was out to this point, right? I've built a fuzzy match, kind of joined them together, and now I can inspect that data. Now, what most people do, right, from that 100% join that we had earlier to this 95% one, they union together as two results, and now I've got kind of have I'm building them a new data set, my new match data set. However, for those that didn't match, right, at that tier, what they'll do is, see my left here, anything that didn't match for my main and anything that didn't match for my new, I'm going to union those back together and go for another round on fuzzy matching. And in this case, it might be a change in rules or a little bit more relaxed, right? And I'll go in and join those two together and inspect that result and then join that into the data set, right? And I could go in and do 25 different iterations of this to make sure that each time I'm running through this fuzzy match, it's kind of updating with a new tier of logic. So that was a lot of information in a little bit of time. And so I just encourage more than anything for you to get out there and get dangerous with it. And so hopefully that got you started. But if you do need more support items, please, please, please go to the community. It's going to be a really great resource to get you up and going and making sure that you are successful with this product. And finally, if you do have any really issues that can't be answered on community, go ahead and reach out to our technical support and make sure you get your questions answered quickly. So that was a lot of information. So I'll just hang on the line here and answer any questions that have come along the way. But if not, we can talk next week, the last training of the year. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week.